Mr. Rainwater.
Hey, Jow.
We're back.
Yep, took a little hiatus.
I don't know if it can be called a hiatus. We called out sick, basically.
Yeah.
That's basically what happened. Life happened for both of us, and sometimes you just can't make a deadline, man. I guess that's something that should be noted to some artists. I know all of us know that feeling of rushing to complete by a deadline, and I think we have a pretty good track record. I mean, we've been doing this for almost like a year and a half-ish now, and it's like, I think we've missed maybe 3 weeks out of like 60, right?
If even that, have we met this? I feel like this is the first week we've missed.
Missed. Like, yeah, like we didn't.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Because previously we had buffer.
That's probably why. Yeah, that's true. We taped a couple of things in advance, and yeah.
Unrelated to the topic of this episode, but artists do blow deadlines, and it's okay.
Absolutely.
Just make it up.
I think it's usually okay if you deliver late with quality. Like it's easy. It's easy to be forgiven if it's one of those types of situations. So we're gonna try and give you some quality tonight, folks. Is all art stolen? Is a very popular discussion in the artist community, I guess you could say. Or better yet,
right.
The other thing, the real way to say it is anything original anymore. And 9 out of 10 artists will tell you no, and that one outside person will give you a giant flowery answer that doesn't necessarily answer the question. It just leaves you confused. So we're going to say no. But there is a particular book that I have been studying called The 7 Basic Plots by Christopher Booker. And basically what it does is, this is very Save the Cat-ish almost, where he dumbed it down into 7 particular stories that are told. So it's not necessarily genres, but it's stories, like the type of story being told. You can tell a coming of age story in a horror movie. You can tell you know what I mean? Like there's different kinds of horror movies, different kinds of dramas, yada, yada, yada. But the kinds that we're talking about. So like, I feel like Blake Snyder was more about defining which genre you fall into and like redefining what a genre is. Whereas Christopher Booker is more about the story that takes place within that genre. So like a genre more so defines the fundamentals of story characteristics that occur that define a genre. Whereas Booker is more defining the character arc of the character's journey, if that makes any sense.
That makes sense.
So I'm going to go through the 7 basic plots really quick right here. And then you and I are going to kind of go over whether or not we think there are more, or if maybe he's extrapolating more than there is out of this and there's actually less. But we will see if we can figure out if he's missing any. That's, I think, is probably a good one to do. But let's get into it. So number 1, very similar to one of Blake Snyder's. Overcoming the monster.
Okay.
Definition. Let me read you the definition. The protagonist sets out to defeat an antagonist force, often evil, which threatens the protagonist and or the protagonist's homeland. Examples of this would be Perseus, Beowulf, Dracula, War of the Worlds, Nicholas Nickleby, Seven Samurai, James Bond, Jaws, Star Wars, and Naruto.
Interesting. I mean, I'm trying to remember. I guess Seven Samurai would work in that. I will have a better idea once we've covered all 7 of them.
Okay.
But I thought that was an interesting choice, Seven Samurai, because it's, if I remember the story correctly, I don't think they were all part of the same like home turf, but I guess the main character it was. So I don't. That's where I'm kind of tripping myself up here.
Okay, well let's go down the other ones and then we'll see if we can go back and redefine. Rags to riches. Definition: the poor protagonist acquires power, wealth, and or a mate, loses it all, and gains it back, growing as a person as a result. Examples would be Cinderella, Aladdin, Jane Eyre, A Little Princess, Great Expectations, David Copperfield, The Red and the Black, The Prince and the Pauper, The Ugly Duckling, The Gold Rush, and The Jerk. I know Cinderella and Aladdin. That list.
The Jerk.
And The Jerk. Okay, and The Jerk.
Yeah.
I haven't watched The Jerk in forever.
That seems like a pretty well hemmed in like categorization, right, of that kind of story type. All right, let's move on.
All right.
I'm noting all this.
The next one would be the quest. Definition. The protagonist and companions set out to acquire an important object or to get to a location. They face temptations and other obstacles along the way. So you end up asking yourself, the example, let me do the examples. The Pilgrim's Progress, The Lord of the Rings, King Solomon's Mines, right. Divine Comedy, Raiders of the Lost Ark, Monty Python and the Holy Grail. See, now this is where it starts getting fuzzy for me because like the quest and overcoming the monster start sounding like the same thing in my head.
Sort of. I mean, I think
maybe it's because a lot of the movies that I know mix those two.
For sure.
You know?
Both of those types of movies I feel like are the standard like summer blockbuster type movie. Like Avengers. Right, like Endgame and Infinity War are kind of like those two together. Basically, you have the monster, like saving your homeland from the monster, right, with Thanos,
right,
and then you have to go time travel to go do all the things to erase that, which is the quest. So, yeah, I would say that's a pretty standard American movie. Like trope, those two together.
So, all right, now here's where I'm going to throw you for a curve, especially after you just gave that. The next one is Voyage and Return. The protagonist goes off to a strange land after overcoming the threats it poses or learning important lessons unique to that location and return with experience. Examples, Alice in Wonderland, Goldilocks and the Three Bears, Peter Rabbit, The Hobbit, The Third Man, Gone with the Wind, Lion King, Back to the Future, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Gulliver's Travels, Peter Pan. Yeah.
See?
This is where it starts getting confusing for me because that sounds a lot like The Quest or Overcoming the Monster. And they're all blurring together at the moment. It's like, you know, maybe Hollywood fucking takes everything as like, oh, we need bigger and better. We need to put all of the 7 plots into this.
Well, so like the way I'm looking at it right now, if the way that this person is categorizing it is like the difference between the voyage and the return and the quest is that with the quest, there isn't necessarily a return. There's like a kind of a point of no return with a lot of quest stories. Case in point, let's go back to Avengers, right? People die, you know, like the world kind of ends to a certain extent, and we go back. But even when we go back, there are things that can't be undone. Whereas the voyage and the return, I think it sounds like a lot of the stuff stays the same, but what changes is internal. So like the main character goes through an internal shift while the world remains mostly the same.
Okay. Let's finish up the rest of the genres. Comedy. Definition. Light and humorous character with a happy or cheerful ending. A dramatic work in which the central motif is the triumph over adverse circumstance, resulting in a successful or happy conclusion. Booker stresses that the comedy is more than humor. It refers to a pattern where the conflict becomes more and more confusing, but is at last made plain in a single clarifying event. The majority of romance films fall into this category. Examples would be A Midsummer's Night Dream, Much Ado About Nothing, Taming of the Shrew, The Alchemist, Bridget Jones's Diary, Four Weddings and a Funeral, The Big Lebowski. See, I can see how Much Ado About Nothing fits into that, because that literally is just a confusing miscommunication after miscommunication, and it just arrives at, it's almost circular, where it's just like, oh, we started here, we ended here, and it's over. And we'll continue to probably get into these kinds of circumstances, but we're cutting it off because there's a change has fully occurred. But for the most part, there's like a minimal change has occurred, I should say. Like, so and so ends up with so and so, and that's it. Like it really, you know what I mean? Like it's a long way. It's like taking the long way home, the scenic route almost.
Yeah.
That's the impression I'm getting from that.
Well, also, I mean, the thing that I was thinking about when, like, I don't know, that description's weird because, so it's interesting that Big Lebowski was included in that setup, because I would also think of Big Lebowski as a noir style film, like a mystery.
Sure.
And that's very different from comedy, because you can have those same sort of setups and it doesn't end happily, right? Like, a lot of times the main character discovers a really dark truth about the world that they live in, that like a movie like Chinatown, or The Matrix, maybe to a lesser extent, or what's the name of that movie, Dark City? I don't know if you've seen that one.
I'm aware of it. I have not seen it.
Yeah, so like all those movies kind of have as a similar fixation, like, here's a revelation about the world that's sort of disturbing instead of like relieving. So like Big Lebowski is a comedic movie, but as you go through it, it's like nothing gets cleared up.
Right.
And that's probably the big difference, right?
Yeah.
You don't feel clarified in the situation that's happened. And that's pretty typical of noir type stories.
Right. And yeah, they just kind of, it's just like, oh, here's a bunch of wacky circumstances that happened. Enjoy.
So I don't know. I mean, granted, maybe there will be more divulged in the next whatever's left of our setups.
We got two more. Tragedy.
Okay. Well, maybe.
So, the protagonist is a hero with a major character flaw or great mistake, which is ultimately their undoing. Their unfortunate end evokes pity at their folly and the fall of a fundamentally good character. Examples would be Bonnie and Clyde, Citizen Kane, John Dillinger, Julius Caesar, Madame Bovary, Oedipus Rex, Romeo and Juliet, Hamilton, and The Great Gatsby.
Yeah, it's fine. I don't know. I don't really see any. I don't really have any comments on that.
Yeah.
I feel like that's a pretty well hemmed in definition of that category.
All right. So we talked about how before, like the quest and overcoming the monster, or like Voyage and Return, all seem kind of to swirl together in almost like one genre when it comes to, at least for Hollywood. I would throw this one in there as well. Hollywood fucking loves to tell this story. Our last of the 7 basic plots, Rebirth. Definition: an event forces the main character to change their ways and often become a better individual. Now, when I hear Rebirth, I think Jesus, Matrix, like, you know what I mean? Like the death and rebirth. Examples of this would be Pride and Prejudice, Beauty and the Beast, A Christmas Carol, Secret Garden, Groundhog Day.
Huh. Groundhog Day really, like, okay, so I was thinking about when I heard you say Groundhog Day, because, like, that's kind of a Voyage and Return type story.
See, and that's where I'm starting to get, like, I think he's milking this a little too much. I don't think there are that many plots.
Well, so, like, getting to what we were originally starting on, right? Like the originality angle, right?
Yeah.
So, like, that's what's really difficult when you put, like, when you try and, like, clump together, like, all these different ideas, right? Because you have to, at some point, if you're saying like I have 7 ideas that are going to clump together all the stories ever made, you have to get very generalized and abstract, right?
Yep.
Where you're almost like metaphorically saying like, oh, but it is a quest when you think about it this way or that way.
Right.
And that's like something, I mean, I'm saying all this is like sort of it's an issue that I think I have with that notion that you can define every story in a set pattern. Like I have this issue with genre too. Like I like a lot of genre melding type stories because I think that genre can be like a help or a hindrance, right? Because like you could be like, you can either use genre and play up on it to make a story much better, or you can go against like your expectations for genre to make something that is at least different, if not original, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's all about like going with and understanding what's been established previously and having a deep knowledge of what's been established previously, and then also understanding within like the logistics, right, of a given genre or type of story, like understanding the mechanics. So like in preparation for next week, I've been watching Scream 1 through 4, and we'll be watching Scream 5 soon. Those are all movies that are very deeply self-aware of the genre that it's in. True. To the point of like putting it right up in front of the audience.
Nudge, wink, wink. Yeah.
Yeah, like basically talking about it out in front. And that's curiously what makes it original, different, because it is like it is kind of going against the genre to a certain extent, because a lot of horror is sort of built on you not knowing what's going to come up next, right?
Absolutely.
Building suspense, and that suspense is hinged on the idea of like you're not really sure how all this is going to play out, what's going to happen. And it's kind of going against it, because a lot of those movies, they just say right up front, like, hey, here's what you should expect in this movie.
Yeah. And that's, it's just like sit there and you just eat your pizza. Like, you know what you get, like, you know what I mean? And Scream is like, oh, you're having pizza. And immediately that makes you question, what the fuck is in this pizza? Like, you know what I mean? Like, that's the brilliance of Scream. Sure.
And so, like, and then going back to Big Lebowski is like part of the reason, like, Big Lebowski is a funny movie for various reasons, but it does have a certain like salt sprinkled on the chocolate kind of a situation where you, as you think about the things that are happening, you go, oh, this is kind of fucked up. Like, this is not, this is a darker world than it initially presents.
Absolutely.
And it's because it's a blending of noir and comedy, which are two genres that really don't seem like they should fit together at all. And yet, like, the Coen brothers figured out some way to do that appropriately. So anyway, like, I feel. Go ahead, Joe.
I was going to ask you, do you think that that's original? Blending those two things because it's so difficult? Do you think that's where originality lies, is accomplishing difficult things, not necessarily things that haven't been thought of, but things that are difficult that most shy away from? Like, I think of something like Scott Pilgrim. When I watched that movie, the way they transition between scenes is not, it screams to me originality because of the way they do it. But when I'm looking at it and I'm really thinking about it, I'm just thinking, well, that's not really necessarily original. It's just really hard to pull off. Like, it's very, you have to be technically accurate and you have to have it planned out ahead of time. And, like, you have to really, there's a lot of moving parts that need to be perfectly timed with one another. Same thing with Baby Driver. Like, you look at that and you know what I mean? Like, a lot of that stuff has to be timed perfectly. It's really fucking hard, but nobody else does it. And that's usually what ends up making something jump out as quote unquote original, because it feels like no one else does it because, oh, it's too hard. They're like lazy filmmaker, lazy storytellers, lazy artists. And it's like, oh, well, these guys tried. And that seems to be what, I don't want to say pivots. What's the word I want? that's what creates originality. As weird as it is to
Well,
say
I
that.
agree. I agree with you that like that how we define originality should be based on like, have you seen this before or not?
Right.
Because there are movies I've seen. There's movies I've seen where I'm like, this is an unoriginal movie.
Mm.
I've seen this scene a million times. I know exactly what's going to happen. And some movies even build themselves off of that, right? I mean,
Sure.
like Star Wars remakes. Like
Yeah.
they're not trying to be original. They're
No.
trying to reignite all the nostalgia and then write on that and then pepper in little new things here and there to kind of to basically make it a little more interesting than you would initially
See,
expect it to be.
and that's why I'm kind of the mindset where everybody likes to say Hollywood is not original anymore. Like they just keep going back to the same well, blah 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 blah. I don't think they want to be original because I feel like the marketing teams, like their whole thing is about brand awareness. You want to sell something that I don't have to really tell you about. You know what I mean? Like I
Yeah.
want you to know what it is and let me just tell you why this one's a little bit better. Like save me half a breath so that I can get your money faster.
Yeah.
And so I almost feel like it's not that Hollywood can't be original because that's like the consensus is Hollywood isn't original. It's I don't think they want to be. It's not that they can't be. I don't think they
Yeah.
want to be.
Well, and this gets into like economics, right? Because like
Sure.
I think that the idea for Hollywood is they're like, well, what's the Coke? Like, what's the Coca Cola of our of our establishment, right?
Not sponsored.
Star Wars easily.
Yeah.
Star Wars is easily Coca Cola. Marvel movies are easily Coca Cola. That's definitely the logic there, and I can't even blame them for that. You know what I mean?
Well,
Because like,
see, I get into this argument a lot with people because they say, "Oh, I'm so tired of remakes and sequels and blah blah blah."
sure, no, I am,
And
for sure.
I'm not. It's not that I am not too, but I have to pay the bills, and movie studios are no different. You know what I mean? For every
Yeah.
for every John Carter that they have to, you know what I mean? Like they have to cover that when it
Yeah.
flops. They have to they have to make 16 Batman movies and over the course of
Yeah.
3 years. Uncle Ben has to keep getting killed so they can reboot this and that, so they can cover those losses. And so like for me, you know, doing as an independent filmmaker, yeah, I would love to wake up every day and go produce a feature film or short films or things that I believe in, things that are original. But I got to do the city council meetings. I got to go do weddings. I got to go do bat mitzvahs and stuff like that. You know what I mean? Like I have to cover those things because that's where some money is. And the kicker is, do I lay back at the end of the day and go, oh, I've got enough money to come home, make a good dinner, throw up, put up Cobra Kai on Netflix and, drink a little whiskey and pass out. Or do I put that money aside and then do I start putting it into new art, new things, original things, fresh things, harder things, more difficult things, creatively risque things? Like, do I, it really comes down to the choice of it. So you can't really blame studios for securing their place in industry. I can't knock them for that anymore. And then on top of that, you look at a lot of the sequels and the remakes and this and that. Half of the problem is the fans and their expectations. When
Sure.
Rob Zombie remade Halloween, I was one of the first people out of the gate dumping on that movie. Like, I was an internet troll, 100% hating that movie top to bottom. Because when I went in, my expectation was, oh, I'm going to get 1978's Halloween, just modern day. And that's not what I got. I got the hillbilly redneck, trashy, not even a B movie. I would call it like a D movie level, like grindhouse horror version of Halloween. It's not what I expected, not what I wanted. Fast forward a couple years later, I'm able to look at that and his sequel, which is almost universally panned, and go, no, this is really fucking good. I actually like watching this. This is different because I want to watch a Halloween movie, but I've watched Halloween 1978 1,000 times this month. It's kind of nice to watch the KFC version, you know what I mean, with people, screaming and just saying fuck or whatever. It's almost refreshing. So when they do a sequel and a reboot, you got to do something. You have an opportunity to do something different. When John Carpenter remade The Thing, the Howard Hughes movie, he didn't make a 1950s B movie. He made an 80s horror movie. And it's one of the greatest horror movies of all time, if not one of the most underrated films of all time. Like, if you can fucking champion Silence of the Lamb as a Best Picture nominee, you need to watch The Thing, John Carpenter's The Thing, because it's really that fucking good. And that's a remake. That's, you know what I mean? Like, no one likes to talk about the ones that are good. They just constantly bring up all of the failures. And most of the failures are the ones that try to retread the either exactly what the fans want, or they go 1,000 degrees in the other direction. So,
well, what's interesting about that too is, like, ultimately what makes John Carpenter's The Thing original is the way that he implements special effects in the film, how he implements like really crazy body horror ideas.
True.
That, like, if you watch the original film, don't use any of that stuff, and it's a more like classical sci-fi horror creepy kind of movie,
right?
You know, where the monster, you don't even really see what the monster looks like. It's kind of this ambiguous human form, you know. And having never read I haven't read the original short story it's all based on, but you know, I don't think it has really that much of a connection to John Carpenter's film.
No.
And so what John Carpenter did is he took the general ideas and then, like, said, hey, how can we make this freaky? You know, like, how can we, like, this is the template in the same way that, like, you know, what was his name? Robertson has templates for stories. He was basically like, well, let's use the original The Thing as a template for all these other ideas that we have for making a horror film. And so to me, you know, that is one argument I would say. Like, it's interesting because it's almost like the name the name's really the brand,
right?
If that makes sense,
right?
You know what I mean? Like, if Coca Cola was like, okay, well, they have tried this before, but we have original Coke and then we have new Coke, right? People didn't like new Coke. But maybe one day they try again and they do hit it off and they're like, we found a new Coke you're going to like along with original Coke, but you might want something different, you know?
It's called Coke Zero, folks.
Well, yeah, I mean, Diet Coke was Coke Zero and Diet Coke were. Diet Coke's probably, there are probably more people who drink Diet Coke versus original Coke.
I would say that's true.
I would argue. Because, like, I don't see that many people who have, like, original Coke in their household. But everybody I know has at least a couple of cans of Diet Coke just sitting around. Yeah,
I don't do Diet Coke. I'm a Coke Zero guy, but it's almost all the same. So it's just a different flavor.
But it's right. It's different ingredients, though, right? Yeah. It's like different ingredients that make a similar drink, which is kind of the exact same thing, right? Of like John Carpenter's The Thing versus, you know, the original Thing or the short story. Right? All different ingredients to make kind of the same recipe, or not recipe, the cocktail. I'm trying to figure out how to put that metaphor together. So anyway, it's difficult because, like, originality comes in so many different flavors too, right? Like, and I think for me, like, I may be burnt out a little bit. For me personally, I am certainly burnt out a little bit on, like, if I want to see something new and original, it has to be like, it has to be in the form of a Marvel movie, or it has to be in the form of a Star Wars film, or whatever, you know,
something where it's a security blanket kind of thing, where it's like, give me something new, but not too new, something that, like, new within what I know. So it's like, if you're gonna feed me bugs, at least dip them in chocolate. Right? Is that kind of what you're saying?
Exactly.
Like, if I'm gonna try beetles and worms and whatever it is, you're gonna put something else that I do know on there. So it's a little bit more of a comfort, and I'm not.
Well, it's the same thing of, like, rappers will show up on, like, not as well known artists to promote those artists, because it's like, hey, we need somebody that everybody's familiar with and comfortable with.
No one will give you a shot, until they have some kind of, and that's one of the things that indie filmmakers do. They will hire name actors to do a day player. Like, they'll have them just do a cameo in their movie. and then they'll fucking put them front and center on the poster, first
Oh,
billing.
yeah.
Like it's kind of a bait and switch, but it's like, oh, will I go see this movie? Oh, so and so's in it. Oh, I guess that means it's legit. I know, what I'm getting when I have a Lance Henriksen movie or a Bruce Campbell movie or something like that. Like it's that familiar blanket of, oh, there's some authenticity here because this person is established or whatnot. I not trying to do that at all. And you know what I mean? I know that's the harder road to travel.
I mean, arguably the hardest, right? Because it's the road where people are going, as we've established, people are going to, in their minds, feel like they're taking the most chances when they don't have named actors. They don't have anything that they're familiar with.
Yeah, it's like walking into a casino you've never heard of.
Right.
Am I going to get robbed here? Like that's.
I haven't seen the slot machine at other casinos. I don't know. Is this just going to literally take my money?
You know what I mean? Like, but it is that agita that people feel where it's like, oh, I might be getting robbed here. This might not be a legit operation going on. And I'm not going to name the horror movie that I watched, but about a week ago, I finally got around to watching a horror movie that I had been aware of for almost a year that had a very big musical artist as one of the driving creative forces behind it. Okay. And very big in the particular genre that this artist is in. Very, what's the word I'm looking for here? Established almost. I'm just going to go ahead and say it. Like it's a rock genre. You would assume from this person who has never done a movie before that because of the quality of their music work, that the movie would be good, or at least not as amateur as it was. I kid you not, I watched maybe 3 to 5 minutes of this movie and I turned it off. Not because I was like, oh, this guy's bad at acting. Not because like the story seemed kind of like horribly written. That happens a lot in independent films.
Yeah.
What rarely happens is there was bad audio work. Like I don't think they had a boom mic on set. I think they were just going off a on-camera mic, and then the camera quality itself was less than what I have. And I have like my primary camera is it's a cine camera, but it's from 2009. So it's like an antique at this moment. And I'm watching this and I'm going, this is terrible. And they cut to another shot. Now it was very clear that they used a drone, right? They were using drone technology, but they filmed that at a different frame rate than they were filming their other thing.
Ooh.
And they color corrected it wrong. So it didn't look like it fit within the same movie. So I watched that. I watched like 3 to 5 minutes and I was like, oh no. No. And immediately I was done. Like the poster looked as authentic as it gets. The guy who was the creative force behind it was as big and reassuring as can be. But 3 to 5 minutes of that movie, no way. Mine's going to be the opposite. When I make Haunted, it's going to be like, does this guy like Photoshop this poster himself, didn't he? He didn't hire a graphic artist. And my goal is in the first 3 to 5 minutes, somebody's going to be sitting there with like an apathetic look on their face, like Hawkeye watching a Broadway musical. And then they're going to start watching the movie and then they're going to do like the whole sit up thing. We're like, hey, this is actually not too fucking wow. This is wow. Which is what that was the exact reaction I got when I premiered Digits. Everybody came up to me and goes, that was a real movie. And I didn't know how to respond to it. I was like, what did you think I was doing? I didn't know you know how to do that. I'm like, I spent 4 years and 120 grand of my money to go learn how to do this. Did you not think I was capable of pulling this off? Not really, man. I mean, just some local schmucks and stuff. I was like, I don't know what to tell you. Thanks. Like,
well, and I think that's really, honestly, when we ask this question about originality, I think when we get to the heart of the situation, it really is not about. I don't think it's really necessarily about originality. It's about new talent. You know what I mean? Like it's about like
perspectives.
It's about perspectives for sure, but also like we don't like. I think people are thinking about like, oh well, we've seen this, X director do all these movies. We're gonna see him do another movie. We're gonna see these actors do another movie, and like how many movies has like Industrial Light and Magic done special effects for forever, right?
Pretty much.
There are plenty of other talented people who have ideas outside of their set of ideas, and you kind of get into this, and it's interesting too because we could kind of tie this also into a lot of the topics going around like diversity in movies and stuff. So like I've been seeing advertisements for Macbeth, and it's starring Denzel Washington. And to me, I'm like, oh, that's going to be a really interesting interpretation, right? Like that's going to be a very unique take on it. And it's a different like representation of the character of Macbeth. And I think that people are really desperate for seeing something new, and they're going to try it in any way they can, right? Even if it means, because Macbeth is basically Marvel. Shakespeare is
the original. Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Shakespeare is the Marvel of like the Renaissance. So like, there's nothing new there in terms of the actual content of the story. And odds are they're probably going to go very, very close to the script. And what's new is you're seeing the interpretation of it from the actors used, from the director who's doing it, because it's going to be shot in a very different way versus like there's a version of Macbeth, I think, with Mel Gibson, or maybe that's Hamlet. I can't remember. But anyway, that's always been one of the big appeals of Shakespearean plays, is that the scripts are always really strong and solid, but really what you're always wanting to see is like, how do these actors interpret these characters? What are the nuances that they bring to it that are particular to them, that are particular to their own life experiences, but also particular to their own conceptions of these characters? Because everybody has a different conception, right?
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring that up, because used to be, for the longest time, I hated anything Shakespeare because I couldn't understand what the fuck they were talking about with that old world English type style of language. And it wasn't until, I think it was 2012, Joss Whedon's Much Ado About Nothing, which we spoke about earlier, came out, and I went to go see it. And he literally, from what I heard, he took home the cameras from shooting Avengers. And on the weekend, him and his Shakespeare friends, who would get together often and just perform like table reads of Shakespeare plays just for fun, shot the movie on the weekend in his house with the Avengers cameras. And that's how he got that done. The interesting thing about it was, it's set modern day. Obviously, everybody's in plain clothing and that kind of stuff. They still spoke the original text, right? Yeah. Here's where it made a difference for me. And this is what I picked up on, was the direction, where the people, the underlying emotions of what they were saying is what helped clue me in as to what the old world English actually meant. So even though I didn't understand what someone was saying at certain times, the tone of their voice, their cadence, their pronunciation, that was the stuff that clued me in as to how it was. And I enjoyed that more than any other Shakespeare thing I've ever seen. And it became a directing class for me, because it's one of those things where, and I tell this to actors when I work with them now, I'm like, I don't care what is actually written on the page. Like, if it could say one thing, whatever, it could be literally the entire dialogue could be I am Groot, just like a Marvel thing. Yeah. And the way you say I am Groot is going to do it. So you can have two characters with like, I'm Groot, but I'm Groot, I'm Groot. Like, and those contrasting things or whatever are saying the story. That's what's breathing it to me. So I started getting to the idea, and especially when you started your last little rant, do you think originality comes from not necessarily just the director, but the direction of something and the choices that people make on which rules they follow and which rules they don't. So
Yeah,
I'm thinking about,
I agree with that
I think
because
that,
that's where you get the new things, right? That's where you get like, at least in that, especially in that context, that's where you get like the situations that haven't happened yet, right? Because like you had mentioned Baby Driver earlier, right?
yeah,
That's a movie that, in terms of like as a plot, it's not necessarily like the most original plot ever. It's you can kind of see how things are gonna go in that movie, but the way that it's done is so different and unique to it. In the way that it's focused on music, it's the main character is very unique, right? In like how he interacts with the world and all the stuff that goes on with his particular like his physical flaws or whatever, you want
yeah,
to
it's
call it.
disability. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's almost like, because like all the other characters outside of him in that movie are kind of like cookie cutter, like thief characters. You know
True.
what I mean? And he stands out as being very different from them because of all of his particularities,
Mm.
right? Like, so I think that there is a lot to say of like new things have a tendency to, it's a contrast thing, right? New things stick out more when they're set up around very familiar things, right?
Well, the interesting thing though is that movie did have very cookie cutter surroundings, but spoiler alert to anybody who hasn't seen it, you get these very familiar character archetypes with like Kevin Spacey as like the big bad guy who's like planning the heist and this and that, and then you have like what's not not John Bernthal,
John Hamm.
John Hamm is kind of set up as like the muscle, and Jamie Foxx is kind of set up as like the crazy guy, right? And then at the end of the movie, it starts like twisting, almost like
Yes.
the car at some point where it's like, oh shit, no, Kevin Spacey's not the big bad, which is even more surprising today. But, you know what I mean? Like you go in and
Yeah.
it's like, oh, I'm getting these characters that I'm familiar with, but then they make the choice to break that rule of maintaining that through line through the end of the movie where it's like, oh, Kevin Spacey's not the big bad guy. He's actually he's like the mentor. He's actually helping Baby Driver, and John Hamm's actually the really big bad guy. And then you start thinking, oh, well, okay, he's going to get away with, nope, arrested. And it's like, oh, wow, that's the end. It's going to end on a downer note. And it's like, no, just sit there for a second. All right, fast forward to him in jail serving his sentence. All right, now he's out and now he's happy. And it's like,
it's a super redemptive ending too. Cause
Yeah.
it's like when you get to the end of that, it's like, oh wow, he's like totally clear of his past. Like he's
yeah,
gone through a rebirth almost to a certain extent, going back to, earlier thing we were talking about. One other thing I want to touch on before we move on. Something else that I thought that was interesting in that movie was the fact that it was set in Atlanta. Because when I was watching, I was like, oh, this is taking place in the South, but I don't know where in the South yet. And I could tell because there were characters that had accents and the way that they're like, specifically Baby's girlfriend. I can't remember her name, but like
Darla or something like that. Yeah.
So I was like, oh, this must take place in the South. And I kept paying attention during the movie, like, oh, where is this supposed to be? Because my first assumption was Houston. And then, like, as the story went on, I figured out it was in Atlanta because I think, like, the police were, like, Atlanta Police Department,
Yeah.
And I thought that was unique because mostly movies, so many of those movies take place in, like, Los Angeles. Like, that's, like, the place, right? Were you going to say something, Joe?
Nope. The people watching this on YouTube will already know it, but I forgot to hit record on Skype, so we're only getting our audio now, and the video is now dropped out of the of the YouTube version. So you're getting the full podcast experience. You're not getting to see us right now, but oh well. Anyway, you can go ahead with what you were saying, but
yeah. So all I was going to say is that's another little bit of uniqueness to that film that you wouldn't find in like another movie. So like once again, it's all those different combinations coming together to make something that's new and different. Because there really aren't any. I can't think of any other movies that are like Baby Driver, and I can't think of too many other. Like, I can't even think of too many music videos that are like Baby Driver. You
I
know?
can't think of any movies that are like anything that Edgar Wright has done. And that might be why he got fired from doing a Marvel movie. He was supposed to be the guy that did Ant-Man, and then that didn't work because I think he was too original for them. He wanted to break rules that Marvel doesn't break. And that's not what's conducive to originality. That's not, you know what I mean? Like, for all we know, if Edgar Wright had done Ant-Man, that might be the greatest fucking Marvel movie that we hadn't seen by that point. Like, I don't know if it would have been better than Infinity War, Endgame. Like, those are crowd pleasers right there. Those deliver on expectation. But to that point, let's be honest, the Ant-Man franchise is not an in-demand one. I'm very, the only reason I'm even slightly interested in going to see the next Ant-Man movie is because I heard Bill Murray is the villain, which
interesting.
That to me is rule breaking, and I'm kind of down for that. But that's where it comes down to with me is like, oh, once I know the rules, once they're broken, it's kind of like Scream. Do you know what I mean? One of the big things about Scream was you don't point out the rules. Everybody knows these unspoken rules: don't have sex and you'll live, and don't drink, don't do drugs, don't say I'll be right back. Like, but once you point them out, that's breaking a rule. Like, you're not supposed to do that. Yeah. With Infinity War, Endgame, all that kind of stuff, time travel, that was breaking a rule that existed only within the Marvel universe. Like, they hadn't really time traveled at that point. So that's what made that fresh. But then you look at something like, have you seen Spider-Man yet? No Way Home?
No, I haven't seen No Way Home yet, although I have some ideas of what's going on in that movie.
Okay, well, I mean, I'm sure you saw the trailer, so they're bringing in villains from old franchises, like the Tobey Maguire, Andrew Garfield franchises are now crossing over into the Marvel universe, and that was like a forbidden door. You don't, you know what I mean? Like, those didn't exist in this universe. No one acknowledges it. And back in 2001, 2002, when we first saw the Tobey Maguire thing, like, we understood this is a separate franchise. When they reboot it with Andrew Garfield, these two things have nothing to do with each other. We will never see these two things on screen. You know what I mean? And then the next thing you know, Doc Ock from that franchise shows up and he's fighting the MCU Peter Parker. Like, that's a rule that got broke. And it's like, that's what we want to see, is those rules get broke. I would argue that up until now, the Spider-Man Marvel movies were kind of drab and not all that overall interesting because what rules did they break? Was there really anything original about it? And no, you can't say that because they followed all the MCU rules. So I think that's where I'm starting to think that originality lies within, is when people tell you, and I think this is a big part of the crowd, not just like studio executives saying you can't do that, but I think it's audiences when they say you can't do that. And then the storyteller, the artist goes, oh yeah? And they do it. And that's usually whether it gets received good or bad. Like, you can, so this is where you're gonna have a meal, Mr. Rainwater, but you can have something like Rian Johnson when he took Last Jedi and he said, oh yeah, you think this is the way it's gonna go? Well, nope. And he pulls the rug on it. And while I can argue I don't enjoy The Last Jedi, I cannot argue against the fact that it is original.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like,
it's exactly why I like that movie so much. And I think that had more to do with just, I was kind of tired of that. I was tired of that flavor of Coke. And then suddenly, Rian Johnson's like, here's Coke with turkey. And I was like, oh, interesting. Very new.
It's very interesting. That's not something I want to drink, though. That's nasty as shit to me. And I'm assuming, going back to our one of our Halloween podcasts, that was the same thing that made Bride of Frankenstein jump up for you, right?
Yeah, it did. And that's why oftentimes, and I say this all the time, but like, that's why I do get into enjoying a lot of like B-movie type stuff, is because I will see like rules broken all the time, ridiculous chances taken on, like, sometimes bad acting, sometimes bad whatever, but you see things that you're not going to see in any other movie, like, you're going to see it done wrong a lot of the times, which is in itself unique. That's a whole other argument too, of like, there might be right ways of doing something wrong, because there's the difference between like a bad movie made by somebody who's competent at enough things to make it enjoyable versus somebody who just doesn't like, who's just like a student or whatever and just doesn't know what they're doing at all.
Yeah, I
Like they're
think
just
knowing
really
it's one of the. I think it's the thing when people talk about breaking rules. They
Yeah.
always talk about you have to know the rules and then you have to know why you're breaking them in order to break them. Where I think what you're saying right now is that amateurs arbitrarily break them for the sake of breaking
Yeah.
them, whereas artists will be like, no, I want to break this rule because I want to do this. I want to get this reaction. I want to
Yeah.
turn the story in this direction. You know what I mean? Like there's a
Because that's the
purpose
thing
to it.
about Bride of Frankenstein is like it's a bad movie not because it's incompetently made. You fully understand what's going on in the story.
Absolutely.
You fully understand all the characters' motivations. It's just as a story really wonky and like there's pacing issues, right? Like there's issues here and there in terms of like structure of the film. But like it's not a horrible movie in the sense of like, not in the same way of like a Neil Breen movie, which is a whole other kind of like horror show where it's just
Yes.
like it's incompetent from top to bottom. And if you're going to enjoy it, you enjoy it because you are reveling in the incompetence, not because, it's some kind of just, it's not like an acquired taste, like a well-made meal.
Yeah.
It's an acquired taste like, oh, here's Coke with doo-doo. Like, this is what I want right now.
It's
So,
when that's what happens when arrogance outweighs ability. I guess
yeah,
that's the way
exactly.
that's the way to describe it. Whereas with something like Bride of Frankenstein, James Whale knew exactly what the fuck he was doing. Like there was
Yeah.
no doubt in his mind he was making a zany, kind of off the wall. And my only issue with that is that I feel like that's a rule you don't break in continuing a franchise. Like I like the idea of. So this is okay. A good way for me to establish how I interpret this. Would you watch The Invisible Man, correct? With Claude Rains? That is equally as wonky and out there, also directed by James Whale, right?
Yeah.
Flamboyant, all those same words and adjectives that you can use to describe Bride of Frankenstein, but can apply to Invisible Man. The issue that I have is that there's a tone established in Frankenstein of that gothic, moody, atmospheric horror that I feel should be carrying. That's the world that we live in. And I don't feel like the world changes that much from movie to movie. But as you look at something like The Invisible Man, which they didn't have a crossover until way later. So at that point, the world in which The Invisible Man exists is open to interpretation. It can be anything.
Yeah.
That character can be anything. Whereas Frankenstein smoking a cigar and drinking a glass of whiskey is a complete departure from what happened in the first movie. And like, if you're doing a spoof movie, I get it. Like, it's not supposed to be a continuation of that world. And so that to me breaks that rule. And that's like the sacred rule to me. Establish a world and maintain that particular world. But if you're going to change that world, you have to explain it. And that's where I don't want to call James Whale an amateur because God knows he was not. He was a fucking master of his craft. He demonstrated he knew what he was doing in every fucking which way. But he didn't, to me, in my personal reason, it felt more like it was a personal thing for him to do that as opposed to he was putting his story he was putting his personal artist growth before what was needed for the story and the film. And that to me is like a rule an artist should not break. If you're going to do that, do something original with it. Like if Christopher Nolan had introduced like the Inception hardware, the suitcase in the Batman movies.
Yeah. It's a little bit of a stretch, sure.
Yeah, but because
movies are so grounded in terms of, for the most part, in terms of believability. Yeah.
Yeah, but the fact that it's just an Inception, all right, I'm down with that. Like I can take that. Like that works. He did it in an original thing. Same thing with Prestige, like how there's like clones and twins and all kinds of
Yeah.
random shit that pops up. He tried that in a different movie, it'd have been like,
Well, and I was gonna say that's a particular Christopher Nolan motif too, is where he will only he's very minimalist in terms of like what he will take as like stretching believability, right?
yeah, he
Because it's like,
uses the word heightened reality.
yeah, that makes sense. I mean, and I think that also has to do with just like the way that he's trying to frame the film, right, and put it together as an entire project. Because like,
Hmm.
look, as much of a mess as Tenet is, you can see how he's putting it together and how he's thinking about it, because like, we're just going to stick to this one concept and the whole story revolves around it. Same thing, right? Same thing with Inception, right? One concept, build an entire story around it. And so when you do it that way, and fortunately for Nolan, he had kind of picked, for all those movies, he's picked very original concepts, right? Like the Prestige, like that actual story. If you just the storyline itself of like dueling stage magicians, that was that was taken from historical context. There's a ton of stories like that,
Mm.
and I shouldn't say a ton, but there are a bunch of stories like that that you can find out there. But what he added to it was this one particular science fiction aspect that really turns everything on its head, right? Because when you get that reveal, it's like, oh, holy shit, like what is going on? You only get the opportunity to do that once in that kind of movie,
Oh,
because
absolutely.
the whole movie's kind of built on that. And I would say that that's one of his biggest strengths as a storyteller, is that he knows how to maximize like a high concept,
Mm.
and not just like make it or not muddy it with a bunch of other things. Because like, if it were like, it's like, so I'm trying to figure out how to make a contrast to this. So the contrast to this, I was thinking, would be like something like Star Wars, right? Where you have a bunch of different like science fiction fantasy concepts being melded together to the point where you're like, well, there's nothing here that I can be explained. I just have to accept it as is. Whereas in a Nolan movie, you want it to be explained. Like, you want to know how that dream machine works.
Yeah.
You want to know how
The
all of those,
mechanics. Yeah.
yeah, you want to know very deeply how all of that works. So you have to stick to that one thing. And it works within that sense of like being deeply fascinated, So I would say, just to kind of like say as a suggestion, a recommendation for artists out there who are trying to figure out how to like do something that's different, original, pick one idea. Because I know like we all have like tons of ideas that we want to wind into our story, right? Where it's like, oh, I have this idea about like, there's this guy and he's got this thing, blah, blah, blah. Nobody's ever seen this before in a movie. Well, then that needs to be your whole story. Like, just stick to that. And then
Yeah.
everything else needs to be wrapped around that. And don't try and make everything new and big. Like, I had been talking with somebody who was interested in being a client for me for like a story that they want to pitch. And they had like that childlike excitement where they're like, every single idea in this story is going to be new and inventive and different. And it's like, you're going to overload the system though.
Yeah.
Because no team you pitch to is going to want to they want to focus on one thing.
Yep.
They don't want like every single element in the story you've never heard of, because that's too much. Like we were saying earlier, it's too much risk. So anyway,
it's also too much work.
yes,
And I don't want to I don't want to call audiences lazy, but for the most part, they are. They're looking to be entertained. Do you know what I mean? Like it's almost like talking about sex, where it's like, oh, I got to do a lot of work for this. I could just go masturbate. Like, like
Yeah.
it's one of those situations where I'll do a little bit of work if it means that I'm going to get to enjoy this. But if I got to do a ton of things, if I got to jump through so many hoops, it's just not
Yeah.
worth it. Like, you know what I mean? I don't care how hot the person is. Like, eh, I'm okay. Like, and that's the kind of mindset that an audience will take. So I agree with you 100%. I feel like you can introduce one new thing per story, and any kind of thing that pulls away or detracts from it, distracts from it, whatever, no good. Too many ideas, you lose focus, you lose the effort level of your audience. Keep it stupid simple. That's
Yeah.
that's why they say that, and I agree with that 100%. All right, so we're wrapping up. I would say that 100% the way to be original in modern day, in my way at least, is to recognize rules that are being set forth, whether they are by your creative entity that's above you, whether it's a boss, whether it's your audience, doesn't matter. Examine the rules that have been set before you. Choose one or two of them and break them. And don't just break them for the sake of breaking them, because I think that's when you get a Last Jedi situation where the crowd will be divisive against you.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But if you want a universal reception one way or the other, go big or go home. That's my real thing. So I like to say, know why you're breaking that rule and commit to it. Don't half-ass it. Don't backwalk it. Don't it was all a dream. None of that kind of nonsense. Commit to it, but break rules. Because that's what's going to be fresh and inventive to your audience, and that's what's going to make you stand out. Like, you don't want to blend in. As much as people are like, oh, I want to make a movie that people consider to be a very Hollywood movie, and make it feel like it's really authentic. No. Like, you want it to have some kind of indie appeal to it. I don't care if it's the most mainstream movie you're making. If you're making a Marvel movie, you kind of want something different in it, and I think that's what gets asses in the seats, and continues to. That's what gets the viral word of mouth going and all that kind of stuff. So that's my 2 cents. Rainwater, what would you say as advice for young artists, or any artists really, to find some originality in their work?
Definitely. I mean, and I say this all the time, but like, the thing that's going to be most original that you bring into the work is going to be most closely related to your own life story and your own life experiences, because those are all those are that's I feel like that's ultimately your most precious jewel box of like things that you can bring that nobody else is going to have.
Yeah.
An actor like Jim Carrey like brings originality and his unique take to things, to movies, because of his life experiences, because of coming up from a life of poverty and working to get to that point where he got to. And then now he has totally new life experiences where he's kind of gone through that stage of like, having gotten fame and wealth, and then like gone through the ennui of it, and then going through meditation and depression and all that other stuff. So now he has a whole other unique take to bring to his acting career, if he even wants to act, because like he does a lot of painting now and stuff like that. So like,
Well, he also tries to kill Sonic the Hedgehog, so
yeah, that is his new career now, and he does bring a unique take to that character, Dr. Robotnik, that's very atypical of anything else I've ever seen.
Really,
like,
I haven't seen the movie, so I don't know.
I mean, I surprisingly liked the movie.
That's
and
what a
I'm
lot of
very,
people have told me. Yeah.
I'm curious to see the sequel because it's a quality made movie, and it's kind of 90s in its sentiments, like it's got, I think because a lot of the people seeing movies now are our generation, and they want to see they want to see 90s style movies basically. Um but like I was saying, like he just like he's bringing himself into his work, right? And that's what makes him as an actor an effective actor. And that goes the same for any director, for anybody who's illustrating or doing graphic design or whatever, you have to bring yourself into it. And it's, I guess that's what we call authenticity, right? To a certain extent, being on it. Like, don't worry about making an authentic, like whatever, like an authentic Hollywood film or an authentic Marvel comic. Worry about making an authentic you project.
I was just
Make
telling
sure that
I was
Go
just
ahead,
telling
Jeff.
my I was just telling my friend yesterday when I was talking about Haunted. I was like, I've arrived at a place where my goal, my terms of, like, everybody says, oh, give it, whenever you're making something as a creator, they say, oh, just, give it your best. Well, I don't know what the fuck my best is. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, does that mean, what does that actually mean? So I had to define that for myself. And I told myself that my definition of my best is if I put the movie on after it's completed on a projector, I can sit there and watch it and enjoy every minute of it myself and be like, that's exactly what I enjoy seeing. That's what I wanted to see. And if film festivals and the rest of the audience hates it and, whatever, then so be it. But if I can sit there and watch it, I'll know that that was my best. So, like, when I watch Digits now, I was telling him, I was like, 94% of that movie I enjoy watching. So I feel like I did my best mostly on that movie. There's nitpicks where I look at things and go, oh, I could have done that better. And, I think the perfectionist in me as an artist is always going to be there nitpicking.
Yeah.
I don't think I'll ever hit 100%. Oh, that was what I wanted. And I think if I do, it'll be the opus syndrome where the artist is like, this is my best thing ever. And then everyone fucking hates it and it's terrible. So I guess that's a good thing that I'll always be like that, but you know what I mean. But yeah, define what your best is. That's what I think a lot of artists need to realize when they're going into it. So like you said, make the most authentically you thing. I think a lot of artists have to come to terms with who they are, what they want, and then be honest with themselves. Not necessarily the audience, but themselves. And then that's the gateway to walk through and to make your best work. Right.
Hey, and a word of caution, sometimes authentically you, is Whale doing Bride of Frankenstein or Neil Breen, like, but that's okay because the world is big enough. The world is big enough even for Neil Breen's and Tommy Wiseau's where it's like, yeah, we can find an audience for that shit because there are people who like it. Like, I mean, one last thing to say too, it's interesting because something that happened with Tommy Wiseau after he made The Room is that he became very aware that people ironically liked The Room. And so he started, like, he made another movie with Greg Sestero, and it was like a self-aware sort of like, ironic movie, and it didn't work. And so it was one of those things where like the authenticity was kind of leaving the work, and so you're not going to get as much enjoyment out of it.
It's kind of like when Red Letter Media made Space Cop.
Yeah, exactly.
They tried to make a bad movie on purpose, and it doesn't work.
So it's just, and maybe that might be another topic for another show to sort of figure out how to skirt, like figuring out what that line is, right?
Yeah.
Like that authenticity line.
Sure.
Because self-awareness can be its own curse to a certain extent.
Absolutely.
But anyway, we'll leave that open for another day.
All right. So we will wrap up tonight, folks. Next week, hold on to your butts because Rainwater will have seen all of the Scream movies. And despite all of the discussion happening about it right now, my opinion is the only one that matters. Because I just want to point out I'm the asshole who watches the Scream movies at least once a month. And that's not even hyperbole. Like once a month, you ask my wife, she'll come home from work or whatever, and one of the movies will be on, or, it's
Even
one of those.
4?
Not as often as the rest of them.
4 was a hard one to get through.
Okay. I didn't realize you had finished 4 yet. Okay. Yeah. That's great. Cause 4 is, the bottom of my rankings, even after watching 5. But that's not a commentary on 5. I'm just saying. Yeah, we'll get into that next week. That's a teaser for you guys. I will break down because there are a lot of people who love 4. I know why they love 4, and I know why they're wrong.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that. That's
so,
good Lord.
some of it has to do with some of the stuff that we discussed tonight.
Yep.
But on the bright side, and continuing to hype up next week's episode, because the new movies come out, Kevin Williamson, who's the original creator, the guy who wrote the first movie, he kind of shunned the franchise after 3. He kind of came back for 4, and then they fucked with him again after that. So he was like almost like a recluse. You could not talk to him about Scream. He didn't want anything to do with it. He didn't want to be associated with it, all that kind of stuff. Then Weinstein, the hat dropped on, or the shoe dropped on Weinstein, and the rights went to a different company, and now he's back involved with 5. So now he's ready to talk about it. So he was talking about a lot of stuff on various interviews and podcasts and stuff that, of course, I fucking swallowed like a whale to get all of this new information. So even if you watched Haunted Home Theater, Scream, which I'll probably end up remaking my own show for those movies, there's new information that I found out, and it was kind of mind-blowing, a lot of it. So we'll definitely be discussing that next week too when we talk about the Scream franchise. So don't miss that. It's going to be highly informative, and maybe you all will learn that you're wrong when you're talking about these movies. Not likely, but I'm going to have evidence to shove in your face to prove it. So if you can't swallow the evidence, get out of the kitchen. I don't know what the fuck that means. I just made it up. I'm tired. Good night.
Good night, y'all.